Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one the Russians have made significant advances within the Kursk region as they fight over the town of Sudzha and the surrounding villages. The Russians also managed to advance west of Bilorivka in the Siversk section of the front line, and they managed to advance north of Velika Novosilka in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. Starting out in the Kursk region, we see that the Russians have made yet another large advance as they capture the towns of Kasatsya Luknia, Kneshi, 2Y and 1Y, Kneshi itself, and Salishenka in the northern flank of Sudzha, as well as the towns of Samuste, Makhnovka, and Dmitriukov in the eastern parts of Sudzha, and the industrial area as well as the residential area east of the river line. They have also managed to cross over the river line into the central parts of Sudzha, where heavy fighting is taking place in the central parts of the town. The fighting here within Sudzha is a connection of the forces from the different sections of the front line. The northwestern section is attacking the northwestern parts of the town, the eastern section is attacking the eastern parts of the town, and the southern section is attacking the southern parts of the town. The sequence of events is that the eastern section connected with the pipeline soldiers, after which they started fighting over the town itself. They started moving alongside the railway to connect with the forces from the east. This allowed them to cut off the Ukrainian forces in the towns of Mikhailovka, Akronom, Bondarivka, and Mirny. Following this, the Russians then moved on to capture the eastern residential area of Sudzha and moved alongside the road between the eastern parts of Sudzha near Mirny towards Samuste. At the same time, the Russians launched an offensive to the south of Sudzha, re-entering Makhnovka, capturing the fortified positions, and then moving onwards towards Samuste and Dmitriukov from the southern flank. Connecting with their forces from the eastern section of Sudzha, they were able to cut off the Ukrainian positions in Dmitriukov and Kulmakov further east. This allowed them to capture both of these towns, and with their forces connecting in a pincer maneuver towards Samuste, they forced the Ukrainians back across the river line and took control over that town as well as the remaining parts of Makhnovka. This then allowed them to cross over into the central parts of Sudzha, both from the eastern parts of the town and from the southern parts of it. At the same time, the Russians launched further offensive operations to the north, where they managed to capture the remaining parts of Kasatsya Luknia, following which they moved alongside the towns, alongside the river line, and captured them one by one towards Salishenka, here alongside the northern edges of Sudzha. Following the capture of Salishenka, they combined their forces into a secondary push further south, where they started fighting over the fortified position to the west of Salishenka and to gain control over the anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth here to the west of Sudzha. With this, the Russians are now moving alongside these fortified positions to capture fortified positions in the western outskirts of Sudzha and to cut off the last remaining highway in and out of the Kursk region. The Ukrainian forces are now just a few hundred meters from a partial encirclement where the main road is cut off. There are some secondary roads here to the west of Sudzha. However, most of these are very limited in capacity compared to the main highway and the secondary roads that are both being cut off with these offensive operations. This means that the Ukrainians within the town either have to withdraw or risk complete encirclement of their forces. If the Russians cut off this last intersection here west of Sudzha, it is unlikely that a large amount of Ukrainian soldiers can withdraw from Sudzha and the majority would be encircled. However, the Ukrainians have already started withdrawing, a lot of them on foot, walking towards the western outskirts of the town, where they hope to get some sort of evacuation. Otherwise, they're forced to move through the forest patches and forest lines out of the Kursk region. At the current pace, the Russians are actually recapturing Sudzha and the remaining parts of the Kursk region at a faster pace than what Ukraine managed to capture when they initially launched their offensive. The offensive operations so far has been taking 3 days, and in 72 hours have managed to capture approximately 290 square kilometers. That means an average of 100 square kilometers every day over the past 3 days. And with the remaining parts under Ukrainian control, we can expect that the Russians will likely capture them within the next 48 hours if they continue at the current pace. And that is with the fact that the majority of Sudzha is now under Russian control. When the remaining parts falls under Russian control, it'll only be a matter of time before the rest falls. As compared to the urban areas of Sudzha, the remaining parts are simply open fields and a few forest lands. The question that then follows, how will the Russians enter the Sumy region? It is likely that they will double down on their northern offensive operations towards Yunakivka and combine it with an offensive from the east to gain control over the eastern and western flanks of the Luknia river line, and to gain control over Yunakivka to act as their forward position here east of Sumy. At the same time, we see that there are several forest patches here to the south, a large forest area north of the city of Sumy, and with this we will likely see some forest fighting over those. However, the Russians are unlikely to go deep within the Sumy territory and are more likely to stay here near the border area. We may see something akin to control over the river line and then onwards to Yunakivka and then the border area near Yunakivka and Setki along the forest patches and create a bridgehead across similar to this. Additional incursions could also happen similar to the Kharkiv direction where they had two separate incursions. One could be here near Tetkino in the northwestern parts of the Sumy region, and another could be further southeast near the border area between Kharkiv and Sumy. Otherwise, the Russians will likely double down on the Kharkiv direction and simply have a small incursion into the Sumy region. In either case, we see heavy fightings taking place over the remaining parts of Sudzha, and the Russians now control approximately 60% of the town agglomeration. Moving on to the eastern section of the front line, the Russians managed to advance west of Bilorivka, both near the town itself, but also further southwest, where they are launching offensive operations along the forest lines to bypass RUAF, as the town itself is completely destroyed. Even the satellite imagery shows how destroyed it is. Therefore, it is more advantageous for the Russians to bypass the town itself, as they do not have any positions to take up within the town, and it's unlikely that the Ukrainians have positions besides those of the fortified positions within the town. The Russians would then look to bypass it towards Serebryanka and then move towards the town there. However, the Ukrainians have a lot of FPV drones and artillery available in the area, which allows them to resist such advances. Therefore, it is likely to continue at this slow pace and no significant changes. To the north of Velika Novosilka, the Russians managed to advance further to gain control over Dnipro and Neheria. According to the latest reports, the Russians moved alongside the river line, the Mokhyali river line, towards the town itself, and with their control over Skudny, they're able to provide fire support, and the Russians managed to gain control over the fortified positions to the northeast of the town. This allowed the Russians to gain control over the town, and the fighting is now reaching into the forest patch area to the northwest of it, as they look to reach the town of Vesele and potentially breaching the defensive line directly head on from a combined effort through Skudny and the forest patch areas to the east of the town, similar to their push into Novocheretsvate. All across the front line, fighting continues, but there's no decisive developments other than the Kursk region, where the Russians managed to make significant advances. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians and Americans discussed the Ukraine war in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia with Saudi mediation, and during these talks, Ukraine agreed to a set of demands of the United States. It is not clear exactly what happened because they are kind of vague with their reports following the meeting, but the most important developments is that they agreed to some sort of mineral deal. Exact contents of it is not public yet, and they also agreed to a suggestion of a 30-day ceasefire. Now that Ukraine has agreed to it, they would need to wait a response from Russia if they would agree to it as well. But it would be a 30-day ceasefire where neither side is allowed to launch any sort of attack on the other side. Now, with long range, short range combat, whatever it is, they are not allowed to do it for 30 days. And that is to facilitate peace talks between the two sides. The interesting thing is whether or not this will actually happen, because it is quite possible for it to happen. Even if they do not believe a peace treaty can happen, they would at least welcome talks. And with pressure from the United States, it is likely that they would at least agree to it. However, it is likely that the Russians would not agree to it right now because they have a strong momentum in the northern section of the front line in the Kursk region. If they're able to make use of this momentum and carry it on into the Sumy region, or potentially increase their efforts in the eastern section of the front line, and generally create some sort of collapse of the Ukrainian front in the eastern section, similar to that what happened in the Kursk region, then the Russians would be able to gain a significant advantage in future negotiations. Therefore, it is a bad time for Russia, militarily speaking, to accept a ceasefire. At the same time, due to Ukraine's agreement to the ceasefire and the minerals deal, and potentially other deals during this meeting, the US stopped the pause in aid, both the intelligence and the military aid being sent to Ukraine. And with this, the situation is back to before Zelensky went to the White House, and there's additional deals on the table. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.